So you could have get sick with it just one more time. But now you gonna get another cardiac on the screen. Down.
All right. First of all, review what we've already talked about in terms of cells. Just a quick review here. We know that every cell on Earth today can be put into one of two categories, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. We know that the only prokaryotic cells on the Earth are bacteria. And they're called prokaryote before the nucleus because, number one, they're thought to be the first things on Earth, the first life. And number two, they don't really have a nucleus. They have DNA, but it's not what? Good word. It's not contained. It's not separated from the rest of the cell. It's not surrounded by a membrane. So let's don't say they don't have a nucleus. Let's say they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. They do have DNA, though. Their DNA is made of a single circular chromosome. One root chromosome. As opposed to how many in a human? 46 per cell. Their chromosome shapes are circles. Our chromosome shapes are linear. So very different. But the chemical DNA, the DNA they have and the DNA we have, it's the same chemical. Very similar. Very, very similar. I'll come back to the significance of that in a minute. Also, remember that prokaryotes lack membrane-bound organelles. Membrane-bound is an important descriptor here. The membrane around our organelles is important because what does it allow the inside of the organelle to be like? Different than the outside. It lets it have two different environments. It separates those environments. And therefore that organelle inside can take on a specific what? Function, a job. And it can become really good at that. It can become specialized. A eukaryotic cell can divide up the work and therefore become much more what? Efficient. Prokaryotes can't do that because they don't have these organelles. Prokaryotes do have ribosomes, which technically are not an organelle. Definitely not a membrane-bound organelle. They're a solid piece of stuff. But the ribosome's job is to do what? Convert DNA. Yeah, use the direction, not really convert it, but they use the directions from DNA to build proteins. Every living thing on Earth has ribosomes. Now realize the prokaryotic ones are a little different than the eukaryotic ones, but they do the same thing. They make proteins. Also remember that every living thing on Earth has a cell membrane. It's made from phospholipids, which we'll talk about in a second. The cell membrane in bacteria is essentially the same as the cell membrane in you. I've mentioned 3 or 4 things that are the same in every known living thing. Same chemical DNA is found in every known living cell. The same kind of cell membrane. There are ribosomes in every known living cell. Many of the enzymes are the same in every known living cell. Cell respiration works basically the same way in just about every known living thing. What do scientists say that implies? That we evolved from a common way. An ancestor. Somewhere way back, there was this one group of living things that became everything else. All those properties that I described that are shared throughout every living thing, we're going to refer to those properties as conserved properties. And that's the term I want you to know about. Conserved properties.
Is this where everything's the same?
Properties that are shared by every living thing, from bacteria all the way through to animals. Properties that are shared amongst all living things. And go ahead and add this to that statement. Therefore implying what? Properties that are shared amongst all living things. Therefore implying what? We all evolved from common ancestors. We should probably get back here. But we all evolved from a common ancestor. Also make note of what some of those conserved properties are. What were some things I said that are conserved properties? Yeah. You've already got a list. Every living thing has ribosomes. Every living thing has DNA. Every living thing has a phospholipid cell membrane. Every living thing shares many of the same exact enzymes. Every living thing shares the metabolic pathway of cell respiration. It works basically the same way in every known thing. So there's all kinds of properties and chemicals that everything on Earth shares. And therefore that implies that we all came from the same thing somewhere way down the line.
What's that saying, Blue?
Conserved property. My handwriting is atrocious, I apologize.
Well, it's the contract and the black and blue that's missing my eyes.
Not as bad as what? Oh, my drawing is amazing. I'm an artist. You laughing at my artwork? I'm offended. Anyway, eukaryotic cells. Kind of already covered this with what the discussion we just had. We know the root means true nucleus because the DNA of a eukaryotic cell is separated from everything else by a membrane. It's a membrane-bound nucleus. Our chromosomes are multiple and linear instead of circular. Again, how many chromosomes do we have in each cell as human beings? 46. Does every eukaryotic cell have 46? No. Like a fruit fly, for example, I think it has 4. There are some fish that have like 90-something chromosomes per cell. So it depends on the species, but all eukaryotes have multiple chromosomes that are linear. Eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane made of phospholipids. We have membrane-bound organelles. Mitochondria, Golgi, lysosomes, etc. And again, because it's got that membrane around it, that allows the inside to be different than everything around it. So it specializes, becomes good at a job, divides up the work of the cell, and increases the efficiency of the cell. That's important. And the examples are everything on Earth except what? Except bacteria. We left off talking about size. Which is bigger? Prokaryotic? Eukaryotic? Eukaryotic, way bigger. And we said that there are some human cells that are so big that you can see them without a microscope. What are those cells? Eggs. Eggs. Human eggs. If you were to take a slide from a woman's ovary, like tissue from a woman's ovary, and put it on a slide, we have some of those next door, and hold it up to the light, you can actually start counting little egg cells inside there with your naked eye. They're pretty big. Well, not quite little babies. They haven't been fertilized, so they're half a baby to some extent. Okay? Yeah, potential babies. Sperm, on the other hand, are tiny. And each one of those little bullets up there, you could fit literally millions of sperm. They're tiny, tiny, tiny. The sperm's job is basically deliver 23 chromosomes, and its job is over, right? What is it? It's a missile to carry 23 chromosomes. That's it. That's what it does. The egg, on the other hand, has a little more work to do. It also has to deliver 23 chromosomes. But in addition to that, what else does that egg have to do? It has to give all the organelles to the baby. All the organelles that you get came from your mother. That turns out to be pretty critical because one of those organelles has its own chromosome, separate from your normal 23 chromosomes. Which organelle is that? Mitochondria. In your homework, you read about where all these organelles supposedly came from. Yeah, but what's the idea that organelles used to be separate living things?
Some basics.
Yeah, they started living inside each other and supposedly became a eukaryote. That's called endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis. We'll talk more about that in next class. But regardless, supposedly what did mitochondria used to be? Their own little what? What kind of cells? Yeah, bacteria. Supposedly there used to be separate living bacteria. So that chromosome that we find inside of mitochondria, what does it look like? It's a loop. It's a single circular loop. All your mitochondrial chromosomes you inherited from who? your mother. Which means, regardless of your sex, you are slightly more genetically related to your mother than you are to your father. Do I know? No. You get one extra tiny, tiny chromosome from your mom that you don't get from your dad. The little mitochondrial. Now, turns out that that's not so significant in terms of the way you look or act. What are most of the genes on that mitochondrial chromosome made to control? Yeah, well, think a little more specific.
Breaking down.
What important process in your body?
ATP.
Cellular respiration, making ATP. Pretty critical, right? Can't do anything without that. But that's mostly what the genes on there tell your body how to do. Turns out those genes can be mutated. And that could be serious, right? If your mitochondrial DNA was mutated, you won't be able to do cell respiration the right way. And if you're a person who's unlucky enough to inherit one of those disorders, who are you blaming?
Mother.
Your mom. Because your dad can't give those to you. Your father does not give you any mitochondrial chromosomes.
So what would that be called? Have you had a...
There are a bunch of weird, rare genetic diseases. I can't tell you the exact name right off the top of my head. But there are hundreds of them related to mutations in the mitochondrial DNA. And almost all of them cause you to have problems making ATP, which oftentimes is deadly. All right, yeah. Questions so far? Let's get into a little new stuff. When you grow, what happens? What makes you grow?
More cells.
You make more cells. Your cells don't get bigger, at least not much bigger. You make more cells. That's what makes you grow. You make more cells. What process makes you make more cells? Mitosis. We grow by mitosis. There's a reason why that has to happen. It seems like it would be easier just to make your cells get bigger, right? Mitosis is pretty complicated. It seems like it would be easier just to stretch your cells. But there's a mathematical reason that your cells need to stay small. And here's why. I'll explain this statement in a minute, but this is why your cells need to stay small. For a cell to be able to work the right way, it has to have a high surface area to volume ratio. And let's think about what that means. For a cell to work correctly, it needs a high surface area to volume ratio.
So, I mean,
I'm about to explain what it means. What part of the cell would represent its surface area? The membrane. And remember, the membrane's job is to what? Yeah. Bring in stuff the cell needs, like oxygen and nutrients, and send out things it needs to get rid of, like waste, right? So it brings in the good stuff, gets rid of the bad stuff. That's what the cell membrane does. We're saying a cell needs a lot of that. It needs a lot of membrane compared to not as much volume, right? What part of the cell would the volume represent? All the inside stuff, the guts of the cell. It turns out mathematically, and I'll show you in mathematics how this happens in a minute, that when a cell gets bigger, this ratio goes down. When a cell grows, the inside of the cell grows proportionally faster than the membrane does. So the only way to keep this high ratio of surface area to volume is to stay what? Stay small. Small things have a high surface area to volume ratio.
what does that mean?
Think of it this way. Let's compare a mouse and an elephant. Which one has the higher surface area to volume ratio? The mouse. What that means is that a mouse is tiny. There's a lot of mouse on the outside. There's not a lot of mouse on the inside, right? On the other hand, an elephant, there's a lot of outside of an elephant, but where's most of an elephant? Inside, right? It's away from the outside.
We're
Inside.
talking about the actual cells rather than just the environment around.
I'm talking about the cell itself. While I'm talking about the mouse and the elephant thing, let's go in a little different direction here for a second. The mouse has a high surface area to volume ratio. The elephant has a low surface area to volume ratio. Both mice and elephants are what kind of animals? Mammals. And therefore, what kind of animals? Warm-blooded. Well, there you care too. Warm-blooded endotherms, right? They're supposed to maintain a constant body temperature. Which animal is it easier for to maintain a constant body temperature? Mouse or elephant? Turns out it's way easier for the elephant.
There's so much more to
Because it takes a lot of cold.
Well, let's think. An elephant is way more efficient. An elephant's rate of metabolism is much lower than a mouse's rate of metabolism. Here's why. A mouse has a large surface area to volume ratio because it's small, which means there's a lot of places where that mouse can lose weight, lose heat. There's a lot of the outside of the mouse in contact with the air around it, right? A lot of places to lose heat. Well, if it loses heat, since it's an endotherm, what does it got to do? It's got to make more. And how does it make more? Cellular respiration, metabolism. So it has to do metabolism really fast to replace all the heat it's losing. On the other hand, an elephant, who has a much lower surface area to volume ratio, most of it is inside, away from what? Away from the air, away from places where it can what? Lose heat. So since it keeps heat in better, its metabolic rate per cell can be what? Much lower. That makes sense? Little animals are always going to have a higher metabolic rate than bigger animals. Every time. Because of this. Bigger animals have a lower ratio of surface area to volume. Bigger animals, I'm not getting that. Bigger animals have a lower ratio of surface area to volume. Smaller animals have a higher surface area to volume ratio. Now I'm not talking about per cell. Per cell, they both have to have what kind of ratio? A large one. Because that's the only way those cells can survive, is if they have a large surface area to volume ratio. Don't confuse my analogy. When I'm talking about a mouse and an elephant, I'm not talking about per cell. I'm talking about for the whole organism. A mouse as an organism has a a mouse as an organism has a high surface area to volume ratio. An elephant as an organism has what? A low one. As you get bigger, your surface area to volume ratio does what? Lowers, decreases. Let me show you that mathematically up here. Let's say we had a cell that was cube. And this is going to be a very terrible cube because my board's off. But let's just imagine that was a cubic cell. Okay? That's a cell. And its dimensions are 1 by 1 by 1. Let's say we're talking about micrometers, small units of area, right? Small unit of length. 1 by 1 by 1. And we got this 1 by 1 by 1 cell. And let's say we want to calculate the surface area of that cell. How do you calculate the surface area of a cube? You go length times width, base times height, be 1. Each cell is going to have an area of 1. How many sides are there in a cube? 6. So 1 times 6. You get an area of 6, in our case, square micrometers. Let's calculate the volume of our cube. How do you calculate the volume of a cube? Length times width times height, so 1 times 1 times 1. So we get 1 cubic micrometer. So our surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. Now let's say our cell grows. And instead of being 1 by 1 by 1, now he's 2 by 2 by 2. In a 2 by 2 by 2 cell, the surface area would be what? It'd be 2 times 2, 4, times 6 sides. It'd be 24. Each side has an area of 4. There's 6 sides. 24. 24 square micrometers. The volume, on the other hand, is going to be what? 2 times 2 times 2. Length times width times height. It's going to be 8. 8 micrometers cubed. Which means the surface area to volume ratio is what? 24 to 8 is also reduced 24 to 8, guys. 24 to 8 is the same as 3 to 1. This was 6 to 1. Now it's only 3 to 1. Let's make it grow one more time. Now this cell goes 3 by 3 by 3. And somewhere I'll fit this on here. 3 by 3 by 3. In a 3 by 3 by 3 cell, the surface area is going to be 3 times 3, 9, times 6, 54. So our surface area is 54 square micrometers. Our volume is going to be what? 3 times 3 times 3, 27. Which means our ratio of surface area to volume is going to be what? 2 to 1. So every time the cell grew, the ratio of surface area to volume got what? Much, much smaller. Which means if we're talking about a cell, it became harder and harder for the cell to what? What do we say the surface area of the cell is? What's the surface area represent? Membrane. So if there's less of it per unit of volume, it becomes harder for the cell to what? Get in what it needs to get in, and get out what it needs to get out.
Less room on the inside.
Not so much less room on the inside, there's less membrane to bring in the stuff. It's harder for it to get in the oxygen and get in the nutrients. So the only way to get around that for a cell is to stay, what? Stay small. Cells stay small so that they have a lot of membrane, a lot of surface area compared to each unit of volume, each unit of the inside. Does that make sense? All right, that being the case, let's talk about the last thing we'll deal with today, which is the cell membrane. Realize that a lot of times it's called the plasma membrane. Same thing. Sometimes you'll see one, sometimes you'll see the other. Know that they're both the same thing. We've already mentioned that it's pretty much the same in every known living thing. It's one of those conserved properties. We've already talked about its functions. Its functions are to bring in things you need, like oxygen and nutrients, and to get rid of things, send out things you need to move out, like wastes. Because it only lets certain things in and certain things out, what adjective is sometimes used to describe the cell membrane?
Permeable.
Yep. Sometimes it might be called semi-permeable, or I heard some of you saying another version of the same thing, selectively permeable. So those mean the same thing, semi-permeable or selectively permeable. They let some things in, won't let other things in.
Wait, so just list functions of the cell membrane?
Yeah. It's semi-permeable or selectively permeable. Some things can come in, some things can't.
What are all the bullets, though?
Look, I'll explain as we go. We just talked about the functions. We'll talk about the structure here in just a second of the cell membrane. What determines whether or not something can get through?
It's polarity.
Okay, part of it has to do with its polarity, its charge. What kinds of things do you think can get through the cell membrane real easy? Charged or uncharged? Turns out uncharged can get through really easily. What else, other than polarity, determines whether or not something can get through? Size. Which gets through easier, big or small? Small. So things that are small and things that are uncharged, non-polar, those things can go through with no problems. Things that are big or things that are charged have a problem getting through. Now there's other ways around that, but through the phospholipid part of the cell membrane, they have a hard time. And we'll get into how in a minute. Let's go ahead and talk about what the cell membrane is made out of. It's mostly made out of these guys, phospholipids. And we're going to look at a picture of what a phospholipid looks like here in a second. Actually, let's go ahead and do it now. Here's a phospholipid. Now, every class today, I have told that on Tuesday, or Tuesday for you guys, when you take the quiz, you need to be able to draw that.
Which one?
All of it. I'm joking. You don't really do it.
What? You said it was next.
You really don't need to be able to draw. But you do need to be able, if you see a picture of it, say, hey, I know that's a phospholipid, and here's what it is. You need to be able to recognize it and know what it does. We're going to talk about some pieces of this thing that you need to be somewhat familiar with.
Isn't that, aren't those the things that like, I remember learning about it in ninth grade, the way it opens up to let stuff in, and it's got one end that likes water and one end that doesn't.
That's where we're headed right now.
I remember it, I just don't remember.
We'll get into a little more detail than you guys did, but that's where we're going. First of all, almost every molecule that we're going to talk about in this class, except for water, is built around what element? What is the core element in living things?
Carbon.
Carbon. Okay. Everything that we talk about, pretty much, except for water, is going to be carbon-based. Notice all the carbon in here. Carbon is everywhere. A fat is built around this thing in the middle. It's called the glycerol. It's 3 carbons with some hydrogens and oxygens. In chemistry, when you have a chemical whose name ends in OL, it's got an OH, it's an alcohol. So this is an alcohol. This glycerol stuff, just this circled part, this is an alcohol. Attached up to 2 of those carbons in that alcohol are these long chains you see right here. Notice these chains are just carbons and hydrogens. Kind of boring. Even the chemistry of them is kind of boring. That's sort of what oil looks like, by the way. That's basically what the structure of oil looks like. Long chains of carbons and hydrogens. Notice where carbon and hydrogen are in the periodic table. Carbon over there in group 4A, hydrogen over here in group 1. Kind of boring places to be in the periodic table. Boring because they're not over there in the top right-hand corner of the periodic table. That's where all the action happens in the periodic table, top right. Ignore group 18 because they're really boring, right? Yeah, they don't do anything. They just kind of sit around, right? But the top right is where the action happens. What do we call those things in the top right, like nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine?
Fluorine's the most electronegative.
That's what I'm looking for. Electronegative. Those elements that I just listed, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine, are said to be really electronegative. Here's what that means. You need to know what electronegativity is because it's hugely important in biology. What kind of bonds, what kind of chemical bonds hold most biological molecules together? What kind of bonds? Mostly covalent. In covalent bonds, what happens with electrons?
They are shared.
They're shared between 2 atoms, right? Things that are electronegative, when they share electrons, they don't share them very evenly, right? They say, yeah, I'll share with you, but it's sort of like one of those people, maybe you're sharing candy with your friend, and your friend says, you have 1 piece and I'll take 2. You have 1 piece and I'll take 2. That's sort of what electronegativity is all about. They share, but they don't really share evenly. So that the negative electrons get pulled closer to nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine, and away from the thing they're sharing them with.
What are they sharing with?
It could be anything. A lot of times it's hydrogen. Very often it's hydrogen. So what happens to the charge of the hydrogen since its electrons are getting pulled away? It becomes kind of positive, and the thing that's electronegative becomes what charge? Negative. So that molecules with a lot of nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine, they become charged. One side of the molecule becomes kind of negative, one side becomes kind of positive, and we call molecules that are that way what? Polar. Polarized. Polar. So they have one side that's negative and one side that's positive. That's called polar. Polar. But notice down here there's really not any nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, or chlorine. So this side of a phospholipid is not polar. It's not charged. It's non-polar. That's an O, by the way. This side up here, on the other hand, has lots of oxygen and nitrogen, right? This side up here is very charged. It's polar. Polar means both. Part of it's positive and part of it's negative. So one side of this becomes positive and the other side becomes negative.
So if it's non-polar, that means it's kind of neutral.
It's neutral, not charged. Non-polar means not charged. Now, an important rule in chemistry. Non-polar things like to be around what? Other non-polar things. And polar things like other polar things. Polar goes with polar. Non-polar goes with non-polar. Like dissolves like. It's kind of a rule you might have heard in chemistry. Like goes with like. Polar to polar. nonpolar to nonpolar. What is maybe, well, without a doubt, the most famous polar molecule on Earth today? Water. Water's charged. Water's polar. It's the positive side and the negative side. So if we put these things in water, which, by the way, these things are always going to be in water, right? Because every living thing is made mostly of, guess what? Water. So when we put these things in water, this side likes the water, right? This side doesn't. Okay? This side is said to be hydrophilic, which means what?
It likes water.
It loves water, yeah. And the other side is hydrophobic, which means it's scared of water. It's afraid of water. It doesn't want to be near water. What disease, common in mammals,
Rabies.
it's called hydrophobia. Yep, rabies, it's called hydrophobia. Why?
Because it's like
Exactly. If you have rabies, your throat swells up and gets really, really raw and sore, and it becomes so painful to swallow that you try not to. And instead of swallowing your saliva down, you just let it leak out the mouth. Therefore, animals with rabies foam at the mouth because they can't swallow very well. It hurts to swallow really, really badly. They're afraid of water. They're afraid to swallow the water. Regardless, this molecule, since it has one side that's charged and one side that's not, sometimes it's called bipolar. We're not talking about the crazy kind of bipolar, right? But there's a more scientific word for this. Oftentimes we'll use this word, amphipathic, to describe this molecule. What's amphi mean?
like amphibians.
Like amphibians. It means it's both. In this case, both polar on one side and nonpolar on the other. In the case of amphibians, both what? Lives on both land and water. But this word means that a molecule has both a polar side and a nonpolar side. Phospholipids, you should know that. They're amphipathic. Oftentimes we'll draw them like this, with the polar part looking like a circle and the nonpolar part looking like lines. Yep. So here's another picture. Here's what happens when we put them in water. The tails, they form a layer, a two-layer structure, first of all. It's called a bilayer, phospholipid bilayer. So that the heads, which like water, are pointing toward the water. There's water outside of a cell. There's water inside of a cell. So those heads are pointing toward the water.
What's in between them? Where the tails are.
Pretty much the tails. There might be a slight amount of water, but not much. It's mostly the tails make up the inside. The tails take up the inside. So that they're away from water where they want to be, and these are to the water where they want to be. So this interior of the cell membrane, this is nonpolar. Yeah, that's terrible. Out here's polar, and out here's polar. So there's that amphipathic nature going on again. Now, important point, and we'll come back to this, maybe not today, but next time. Even though the phospholipids are bipolar, by far, what's the biggest part of the cell membrane? The polar part or the nonpolar part? The nonpolar part. And that turns out to be real, real important. And we'll get into why it's important next time. Some reminders.